Prepare yourself for a journey through war and adventure. Follow Fitzroy Maclean as he takes you to the blazing deserts of North Africa. These are his words. Let's begin. In September 1942, one arm of the vast German pincer movement, which was threatening the entire Allied position in the Middle East, had arrived at a point less than 100 miles from Cairo and Alexandria. The other was reaching down through the Caucasus towards Persia. In Egypt, the newly arrived commander of the 8th Army, General Montgomery, was marshalling his forces for an assault on the enemy positions at El Alamein. In southern Russia, the Germans had attacked the town of Stalingrad, and bitter fighting was in progress there. If the 8th Army's offensive failed and the Germans broke through to the Nile Delta, there was a danger that they would continue their progress through Egypt and Palestine into Iraq and Persia. Likewise, it seemed probable that the fall of Stalingrad would shortly remove the last obstacle to a German advance into these same countries from the north. Persia was the gateway to India. It was the source of immensely important oil supplies. Through it ran the main Anglo-American supply line to the Soviet Union. It was occupied at this time by a small force of British and Soviet troops, whose timely arrival had forestalled Reza Shah's plan to turn Persia into a Nazi base. However, it seemed unlikely that they would be able to hold up the progress of a victorious German army, advancing either from the north or from the west. Against this general background, after my return from Kufra, I was ordered to proceed to General Headquarters, GHQ Persia and Iraq Command in Baghdad. My task was to discuss with the Commander-in-Chief, General Maitland Wilson, the possibility of raising a small force on SAS lines to operate on enemy-occupied territory in Persia, in the event of a German breakthrough. There was no time to be lost. I hurried down to the Canal Zone, collected a new jeep, some maps, a week's rations, warm clothes, and Guardsman Duncan, and set out post-haste for Baghdad and points east. We had an uneventful journey across the Suez Canal and through the Sinai Desert to Gaza and Beersheba, through Palestine to Lebanon and Syria, and from Damascus across the desert to Baghdad. On the way, we cooked our meals by the roadside and slept when night overtook us. In one sense, it seemed like a continuation of the drive back from Benghazi. However, this time we had plenty to eat and drink, we could sleep peacefully at night, and we did not need to be constantly scanning the skies for enemy aircraft. Upon reaching Baghdad, I had a discussion with General Wilson, who gave me the authority to raise from the troops under his command a force of about 150 volunteers, with a high proportion of officers and non-commissioned officers, NCOS, and he urged me to waste no time in making a reconnaissance of the areas where we should operate if Persia fell into enemy hands. We produced a map and studied it together, aiming to identify suitable bases from which irregulars might operate. The Commander-in-Chief was a massive man physically, and it wasn't until we examined the map together that I realized he combined a somewhat weighty manner with great alertness of intellect and a remarkable eye for terrain. The A and Q branches of GHQ provided me with a flexible establishment and a generous scale of arms and equipment. My private army, which was to be known as M Detachment, SAS Regiment, was to report directly to GHQ Persia and Iraq Command for operational purposes. The training program would include parachuting and any other methods of infiltration that might be required. Guardsman Duncan and I refueled the jeep with petrol, stocked up on food, and set out for Persia. At the frontier at Karnakin, the Baroque customs house was still there, but this time, Indian sentries had replaced the soldiers of the Shah. Thereafter, we followed the same route that I had taken in 1938, Kermanshah, Hamadan, Qazvin, and Tehran. I was glad to be back in Central Asia, with its clear light and pure dry air, its distant ranges of blue mountains, its arid plains, and its little villages of flat-roofed mud houses clustered amid a grove of green poplars on the bare hillsides. For the next 2 or 3 weeks, I pleasantly toured British units in Persia, calling for volunteers, while also making a reconnaissance of the regions most likely to furnish bases for irregular operations. The prolonged inactivity had left our troops in Persia eager for a change, and there was an abundance of volunteers from which to choose. All were willing to give up rank and pay in exchange for the prospect of early action. The results of my reconnaissance were no less encouraging. Everywhere, the mountains provided ideal conditions for irregular operations. From Tehran, I went north over the Elburz range into the Soviet-occupied provinces of Gilan and Mazandaran on the shores of the Caspian, where the semi-tropical jungle offered excellent cover for guerrillas. Then I went west into Luristan, a traditional hideout for bandits, and south into the Dasht-i-Kavir, the vast and largely unexplored salt desert that stretched across central Persia, traversed only by occasional camel tracks and dotted with salt marshes and quicksands. Here, there were clear possibilities of reproducing the conditions under which we had operated in the Western Desert. Aircraft could land, supplies could be dropped, and there were excellent opportunities for camouflage and lying low. Most importantly, the railway line, the main roads, and Tehran itself were all within striking distance. The potential to disrupt an occupying force seemed so great that I found it incredible that the Germans had not already tried something similar. Just as I was preparing to set up camp and start training the nucleus of my force, I received a signal instructing me to report immediately to General Wilson's Chief of Staff, General Bayon, who had just arrived in Tehran from Baghdad. At Tehran, I found General Bayon at the British legation, in conference with the minister, Sir Rida Bullard. They told me they had a job for me. For some time, they said, there had been signs of brewing trouble in southern Persia. The Kashgai and Bakhtiari tribes had German agents living among them and seemed likely to revolt at any moment, as they had done in 1916 when their rebellion caused us considerable trouble. If this were to happen, our supply route to the Persian Gulf might be cut off. There was also discontent in Isfahan and other towns, largely due to grain hoarding by speculators, which we were unable to prevent. This discontent could quickly flare up into open rebellion. Even worse, if trouble did erupt, the Persian troops in southern Persia would likely side with the rioters. A key figure in all this was General Zahedi, who commanded the Persian forces in the Isfahan area. Zahedi was notorious for being one of the worst grain hoarders in the country. Moreover, there was ample evidence to suggest that he was cooperating with the tribal leaders, and that he was in contact with German agents living in the hills and, through them, the German High Command in the Caucasus. In fact, secret reports indicated that Zahedi was planning a general uprising against the Allied occupation forces, with his troops and those of the Persian general in the Soviet-occupied northern zone participating, and that this would coincide with a German airborne attack on the 10th Army, followed by a broader German offensive on the Caucasus front. In short, General Zahedi appeared to be behind much of the trouble brewing in southern Persia. The situation was a delicate one. The Allied occupation forces in northern Persia had been reduced to a minimum due to demands from the fighting fronts, and there were virtually no Allied troops in southern Persia. The nearest British troops were stationed in Qum, 200 miles north of Isfahan. Any sudden movement of British troops southward could provoke a general uprising, which we would struggle to contain with our limited forces. On the other hand, allowing events to proceed unchecked would be equally disastrous. In short, it was essential to nip the trouble in the bud while avoiding a full-scale confrontation. General Bayon and Sir Rida Bullard had decided that this could best be achieved by the removal of General Zahedi, and they had chosen me to carry out this task. How it was to be done was left to me to figure out, with only two conditions: I had to take Zahedi alive, and I had to do so without causing a disturbance. My first step was to go to Isfahan and assess the situation for myself. The city's mosques and palaces, unrivaled in all of Asia, provided a perfect excuse for my visit. I let it be known in Tehran that I was going to spend a few days sightseeing in the south and set out. I reached Isfahan that same night after driving all day across a bleak plateau, fringed with distant, snow-capped mountains. Finally, the flickering lights of an isolated chaikhana shone out of the darkness, showing 2 or 3 dim figures squatting in the doorway, drinking tea and smoking their long pipes. Then there were some houses, some shops, and suddenly we were in the main street of Isfahan, in a seething stream of carts, donkeys, and camels, whose owners turned to stare at the first jeep and British uniforms to appear in the city. I drove to the British consulate, where I was welcomed by the consul, John Galt, with the lavish hospitality I had always encountered at the hands of His Majesty's consular representatives in Persia. Soon Duncan and I, in a time-honored phrase of the British soldier, had our knees under the table, enjoying a meal of local partridge, washed down with delicious wine from the town of Shiraz, which, according to some, contests with Caceres the honor of being the birthplace of sherry. Over dinner I confided to my host, a robust young man who seemed alert both mentally and physically, the real purpose of my visit. He was delighted. General Zahedi, though pleasant in person, was, he said, a thoroughly bad character, a bitter enemy of the Allies, a man of unpleasant personal habits, and, through his grain-hoarding activities, a source of popular discontent and an obstacle to the effective administration of southern Persia. He, too, had heard of Zahedi's involvement with the Germans and tribal leaders. In fact, according to information he had received, one of Zahedi's first moves in his plot was to be the assassination of the British consul in Isfahan, a revelation that erased any personal charm the general might have possessed. I asked Galt where Zahedi lived. He said he would show me, and after dinner, we strolled out of the consulate, crossed a narrow, many-arched bridge, and walked along a broad avenue of plane trees until we came to a massive pair of gates, set in a high stone wall, flanked by a sentry box and guardroom. Outside, a Persian infantryman was marching up and down, while others, all well armed, loitered by the door of the guardroom. We walked around to the back, where the wall was pierced by another gate, guarded by another sentry. This was the general's residence. We then continued our stroll under the trees along the avenue. A few hundred yards further on, we came to a large modern barracks, which, according to Galt, housed most of the garrison of Isfahan, ready to rush to their commander's assistance in case of trouble. It seemed that a frontal assault by a small raiding party stood little chance of success. If Zahedi could not conveniently be coaxed out of his residence, the obvious alternative was to ambush him while he was traveling. I learned from Galt that Zahedi crossed the bridge at the same time every morning on his way to his headquarters. Would it not be possible, I wondered, to take advantage of the narrow bottleneck formed by the ancient bridge to stop his car, pull him out, and make off with him? I considered this plan carefully, but two serious obstacles arose. First, Zahedi was rumored to go nowhere without a heavily armed bodyguard, who would need to be subdued. Second, even if we managed to avoid a pitched battle with the bodyguard, it seemed unlikely that we could kidnap a general in broad daylight in the middle of such a populous town as Isfahan without attracting a great deal of attention. Our peaceful drive through the city in the jeep had been novel enough to hold up traffic on the main street. Adding a struggling general and his bereft bodyguard to the scene would certainly cause an uproar, the very thing my superiors wanted to avoid. I went to bed that night with the uneasy feeling that the problem was more complicated than it had first appeared. The next day, after more reflection and another discussion with Galt, I concluded that unless I was prepared to risk a serious incident with unpredictable consequences, I would have to rely on a ruse. In short, I needed a Trojan horse. Once I started thinking along these lines, a plan soon took shape in my mind, which seemed to offer a better chance of eliminating the source of the trouble neatly and effectively without igniting the powder keg of southern Persia. That afternoon, I sent a cipher telegram to Tehran, outlining my proposal for Operation Pongo, the code name I had chosen for the abduction of General Zahedi. The first step was to find a pretext for getting myself inside Zahedi's house. I suggested that I be authorized to wear the insignia of a brigadier for the occasion, then call Zahedi's house and announce myself as a senior staff officer from Baghdad, seeking to pay my respects to the general. If Zahedi agreed, I would drive up in a staff car, accompanied by Duncan and a couple of other resourceful individuals, hold him at gunpoint, hustle him into the car, and drive away from Isfahan before the alarm could be raised. I also requested a platoon of British infantry to assist in case something went wrong, and I pledged to figure out a way to bring them into Isfahan discreetly. After sending my telegram, I spent 2 pleasant days in Isfahan, conducting a detailed reconnaissance of the city, paying particular attention to the best routes of withdrawal in case of an emergency, while also enjoying its unrivaled beauty. Isfahan, along with Peking and Bokhara, is one of the few cities in the world that lives up to its reputation. Galt had taken up residence in a charming old Persian house, fronted by a lofty veranda overlooking a walled garden. A short walk along a poplar-lined avenue brought us to the Maidan-i-Shah, the vast main square of the city, once the royal polo ground. On one side stands the Alakapu, or Great Gate, the entrance to the royal palace, known as the Kiel Situn for its 40 pillars. Above the gate is a splendid veranda, from which, when Isfahan was the capital, the monarch could watch polo, wild beast shows, or the arrival of foreign envoys paying homage to the King of Kings. At the southern end of the Maidan, near the palace, is the great royal mosque, the Masjid-i-Shah, while opposite, on the eastern side, stands the smaller but more exquisite mosque of Sheikh Lutfullah. Inside and out, the dome is encrusted with glazed tiles, dazzling under the hot Persian sun and cool, mysterious in the filtered light that penetrates the intricate arabesques of the narrow windows. On the northern side of the square stands the entrance to the labyrinthine passages of the Great Bazaar. There, you can wander for hours among piles of pomegranates, heaps of saddlebags, prayer mats, and lambskins, in and out of the stalls of cobblers, rope makers, confectioners, and goldsmiths, all hawking their wares and bargaining loudly with one another and their customers. Despite the ugly modern statue of the late Shah and his misguided attempts, fortunately abandoned by his successor, to force Persia into a superficial imitation of a modern Western state, Isfahan recalls the grandeur of a great capital city from the Middle Ages. The arrival of an urgent message from GHQ, replying to my telegram, brought me back to the realities of the Second World War. My plan was approved in principle, and I was instructed to proceed with preparations. However, one part of my highly unorthodox plan raised objections among the more conventional staff officers. It was not possible, they said, to authorize an officer of my rank, I was a captain, to pose as a brigadier, even for a day. Instead, they offered me the services of a real brigadier for a limited time, and for the purposes of the operation, he would receive his orders from me. For administrative purposes, I was directed to report to General Anderson, the corps commander, at Qum, some 200 miles from Isfahan. He had been asked to provide me with the brigadier, as well as the necessary troops, equipment, and transport. I wasted no time reporting to corps headquarters, where I was provided with a platoon of Seaforth Highlanders, who were told that they had been specially selected for training in commando tactics. Since surprise was essential to the success of the mission, secrecy was paramount, and at this point, only the corps commander and I were aware of our true objective. The Seaforths were equipped with Tommy guns and hand grenades, and we headed to a remote part of the desert near Qum to rehearse the operation. I had decided that the Seaforths should only be used in case of an emergency. My plan was for the Seaforths to arrive in Isfahan in 2 covered trucks, disguised as civilian vehicles, shortly before I set out for Zahidi's house. One truck would park across from the main entrance, under the plane trees on the far side of the avenue. The other would cover the back entrance. The men, clutching their Tommy guns and hand grenades, would remain hidden in the back of the trucks. Only if they heard gunfire or a prearranged signal of 3 whistle blasts would they spring into action, overpower the guards, and force their way into the house. Their job would then be to cover our retreat with Zahidi in the staff car. If all went smoothly, the trucks would simply follow the staff car out of Isfahan and escort us to a point in the desert, where an aircraft would be waiting to fly our prisoner out of the country. For our rehearsals, I chose a ruined fort in the desert. Again and again, the trucks took up their positions outside, the staff car pulled up, the whistle blew, and the Seaforths poured out of the trucks, stormed the fort, and bundled an imaginary victim into the car. The whole convoy would then drive off in triumph, throwing dummy hand grenades at imaginary pursuers. The Seaforths gave a thoroughly convincing performance, so much so that my only concern was that, on the day of the operation, they might emerge prematurely, regardless of the situation, and massacre a number of innocent Persians in their exuberance. All that remained was to set the day. After further exchanges with GHQ Baghdad and the Foreign Office in Tehran, D-Day was fixed. I also managed, after some difficulty, to obtain permission to shoot General Zahidi if he was armed and resisted arrest. On D-1, we set out from Qum. I had decided that the Seaforths should spend the night hidden in the desert, about 10 miles from Isfahan. The next day, while the main party entered the town in 2 trucks, smaller groups were assigned to cut the telegraph wires connecting Isfahan with neighboring Persian garrisons. Meanwhile, I picked up the brigadier, a distinguished officer with a keen sense of humor, who fully embraced the somewhat ambiguous role assigned to him, and we set off for the British consulate. Once there, a telephone call was made to Zahidi's house, and an appointment was scheduled for that afternoon. After a hearty lunch, we took our places in the staff car, which was flying a large Union Jack. A reliable NCO, armed to the teeth, sat next to the driver, while Guardsman Duncan and a Seaforth Highlander, both with Tommy guns, crouched under a tarpaulin in the luggage compartment. Galt followed in his own car. As we approached Zahidi's house, I was relieved to see our 2 trucks, their tarpaulins concealing the eager Seaforths, parked in position. At the gate, the Persian sentry was engrossed in conversation with Lawrence Lockhart, a Persian linguist from RAF Intelligence, whose assistance I had enlisted for the operation. So far, everything was going according to plan. When we arrived, the sentry at the gate reluctantly extinguished the cigarette Lockhart had given him, broke off his conversation, and saluted. We drove up the drive and parked outside a pair of open French windows. A servant led us inside and went to fetch the general. A couple of minutes later, General Zahidi, a dapper figure in a tight-fitting grey uniform and highly polished boots, entered the room, only to find himself staring down the barrel of my Colt automatic. There was no need to prolong the encounter. Without further ado, I ordered the general to raise his hands and informed him that I had instructions to arrest him, warning that if he made any noise or attempted to resist, he would be shot. I then confiscated his pistol, hustled him through the window, and into the waiting car, which had its engine running. To my relief, the much-advertised bodyguard was nowhere to be seen. As we passed the guardroom, the sentry once again saluted, and Zahidi, sitting bolt upright with my pistol pressed to his ribs and Duncan breathing down his neck, returned the salute. The 2 plain vans, their occupants bitterly disappointed, followed behind, and the convoy quickly crossed the bridge and sped down the avenue leading out of Isfahan. Some miles outside the town, we passed a large barracks filled with Zahidi's troops, but the wire-cutting party had done its job, and no alarm had been raised. Zahidi remained seated, assuring me that there was a reasonable explanation for any of his actions that might appear suspicious. Soon we reached the spot in the desert where we had camped the night before, and I handed over my prisoner to an officer and 6 men, who were waiting to drive him to the nearest landing ground, where an aircraft was ready to fly him to Palestine. That was the last I saw of General Zahidi, although nearly 5 years later, I was amused to read in the newspaper that he had returned to Persia and once again taken command of the southern Persian military district. After bidding farewell to the brigadier, whose role in the operation was now complete, and sending a signal to General Wilson to announce the success of Operation Pongo, I returned to the town to wrap up any remaining details, accompanied by a few Seaforths. My first stop was Zahidi's headquarters, which I entered with 6 Seaforths armed with Tommy guns. Galt had told me that Zahidi's chief of staff was not only hostile to the Allies but also extremely belligerent. The exaggerated politeness with which he now greeted me left no doubt that news of Zahidi's abduction had already spread. Taking him with me, I returned to Zahidi's house, where we conducted a thorough search. In the general's bedroom, I found a collection of German-made automatic weapons, some silk underwear, opium, an illustrated directory of Isfahan's prostitutes, and a large number of letters and papers, which I took back to the consulate. That night, the Seaforths camped in the consulate garden in case of any unrest, and Galt and I settled down to examine Zahidi's correspondence. One of the first letters that caught our attention was from a man styling himself the German consul general for southern Persia, apparently residing somewhere in the hills to the south. He praised Zahidi's activities and requested more supplies. His letter made it clear that the general's arrest had come not a moment too soon. That concludes the 6th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.